Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to teach you the Caro Kann defense, which is a good opening and a easy to learn opening for beginners and intermediate players. The good thing about this opening is that if you try to master this opening, you can even play this opening in the advanced level, and it is very competent, solid, and tough. Okay. The Caro Kann defense starts with a response to the opponent's king's pawn opening. That is, if your opponent plays e4, that's the king's pawn opening. We are not going to play e5 or c5, the Sicilian, get into a lot of theory. We play the move c6. We move this pawn to c6, and yes, white can do a lot of things here. White can put two pawns in the center, which is a principal stuff, and it will lead to a lot of main lines. And he can even develop the knights to f3 or the knight to c3. He can do the similar things. So let's start with the principal stuff. Let's say your opponent goes d4, we go d5. On move 3, white has three choices in this position. He can either take this pawn. Okay, now right now we are playing this pawn to d5 and challenging the center. White can actually take this pawn or defend this pawn with a knight or a bishop or something, or even a pawn. He can defend this pawn or he can push this pawn. Depending on what white does, they have to play in a certain way. Let's say our opponent e takes d5, we recapture with the pawn. C takes d5. And this is the exchange variation of the Caro Kann defense. That is, we exchange the pawns. That is, we capture the pawns. Okay, clear. And now we have to just develop our pieces naturally. That is, let's say our opponent plays knight f3, we develop our knight to c6. Let's say our opponent develops the other knight, we develop the other knight to f6. Let's say he plays bishop to e3 or bishop f4. Let's say he goes bishop to e3. We play bishop to g4 in this case because we have the spin right there. Or let's say if your opponent played bishop e2, in this case it's not a good idea to play bishop g4 because this knight can actually move and there is no threat to the queen or something. So it's not better to go bishop g4. So in this case we can go bishop to f5. Let's say our opponent plays bishop e3, we go bishop to g4, and let's say he goes bishop to e2, then we go play the move e6. This is very crucial. That is, we should not block this light squared bishop in c8. Okay, we should not block this bishop by playing e6. We should find a square for this bishop to develop, either to g4 or to the f5 square. These two squares, we should develop the bishop whichever is more convenient to the position. So we have to develop these bishops, and then we have to play this move e6. So we develop this move, we play this move e6. And let's say your opponent castles, you can go bishop to e7 or bishop to d6. Let's say you go bishop to e7, and let's say your opponent goes queen to d2, you castle, your opponent brings the rook to the center, you play queen to c7. Let's say your opponent brings the other rook, you bring the rooks to the open c and d files, or even to the e file. So yeah, that's how. And in the future you can just play a6 to restrict the movement of this knight to b5, and then you can play a6 and b5 and expand on the queen side. So you will be having more space on this side of the board. So this part you will be having more space once you play a6 and b5. So yeah, these are the ideas about the middle game. Yeah, so we just completed the opening, so we entered the middle game stages of the game. So if you just know this, just developing the knights, developing the bishop, developing the light squared bishop, and then playing e6 and making this pawn chain, then developing the queen, bringing connecting the rooks, and bringing the rooks to the central files. you are good to go and you can play the exchange variation of the Caro Kann defense. Now let's move on to what else white can do. Your opponent plays e4, you play 6, c6, d4, d5. Let's say your opponent defends the pawn by playing knight to c3. He can also defend by playing knight to d2, but both transform into similar positions. What I want you to remember is whenever your opponent leaves the pawn on e4, you just grab that pawn. Let's say here he just defended the pawn. You just take the pawn on e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4. Here you have two options. One is actually you have three options. Uh, the main move here is the bishop to f5 and challenging this knight immediately. This is the classical variation of the Caro Kann defense. That is, the opponent defends the pawn and then you capture and then the knight lands there. And if you develop this bishop to f5, this is the classical variation of the Caro Kann defense. Here you also have another option. The thing is, this variation leads to a lot of theory. It's not that difficult theory as you have to learn for the Sicilian defense, but there is quite some theory that you have to know in this position. So it's the classical variation, and the other option that you have here is playing the knight to f6 and challenging this knight immediately. You play this move knight to f6, and the best move for white in this position is to capture this knight. And again here you have two variations. One is capturing with the e pawn, e takes f6, or you can capture with the g pawn. Okay, let's say you capture with the e pawn. This is known as the Tartakower variation of the Caro Kann defense. Tartakower, yeah. Don't worry if you cannot pronounce it. You can just know the ideas of the opening. That's enough. So yeah. So this is many will consider this is a double pawn and we don't have much control over the center, they would argue, but I would say we have a good control over the center. That is, yeah, we control e5 and d5, and this pawn is will act like an additional protection and it will block the movement of this f3 knight. Once this knight lands on f3, there is no forward momentum for this knight. From f3 it cannot come forward, so it's an extra protection for you in this opening, so it's an advantage. So you capture e takes f6. This is the Tartakower variation. Let's say your opponent f3, you play bishop to d6. We want to develop our king side first, then castle. That's the main idea behind this opening. Let's say your opponent goes bishop to d3, you castle, and then your opponent also castles. Then you play uh, rook to e8. Your opponent plays c3, let's say. You play the move knight to d7. And your idea is you don't want to develop this bishop first. You want to develop this knight to d7. Okay? Then you can go b5, a5 in this position. And you will find a way to develop this knight either to b6 or to f8. You may say, what? Do I put my knight on f8? Is that a developing square? I just put my piece on the back rank. But no. There is a saying in chess that is knight on f8, never mate. That is, if you have a knight on f8 square, you will never get checkmated because usually they checkmate on you on h7 and g7. If a knight is on f8, it easily defends the h7 square. And if they are like trying to mate you on g7, you can even put your knight on g6 and you can cover the attack from wherever it's coming. So it's such a flexible knight. But this knight will not only serve the purpose of defense, but it will also serve as a purpose of attacking by playing the knight to g6 or e6 and then going for a, sorry about that arrow, and then going for a king side attack if we do so. after developing this bishop. So what all of these things looks like, let's say your opponent goes bishop 3, you go b5, say he goes a3, you can go a5. So you have this crown like structure on the queen side, and let's say your opponent develops the queen, you can go knight to b6, or I would prefer knight to f8. It's such a flexible move, so you go knight to f8 and you develop this bishop to g4. Most of the times in Tartakower variation, you develop this bishop to g4 and you have to threaten this knight, because this f3 knight doesn't belong to this square. This knight should have gone to e2. From g1 it should have gone to e2, but most players up until the intermediate and even strong intermediate levels, they don't know the theory of this particular opening, so they just naturally develop knight to f3 all the time. So here you are already threatening to take this knight and damage the structure, which would look something like, let's say your opponent is careless and does something. So he goes rook e1, you just take and see, already white's king side is shattered and the king is wide open, so it's easier to attack the king. So that is how this opening looks. You also have a choice in this position to recapture with the g pawn, that is the Bronchstein-Larsen. This is known as the Bronchstein-Larsen of the Caro Kann defense variation. We saw e takes f6, that is the Tartakower. Now it's g takes f6. We capture with this pawn towards the center. At the beginning, you may look, what? I'm just opening my king side. How do I castle king side after developing this bishop? It will be so wide open. Yes, you are not going to castle on the king side. We are going to castle the other way. We are going to castle in the queen side. So our idea here is, once white castles king side, we put our rook on g8 and we just this king pressure the white's king side using this semi-open g file, which is such an advantage and it will lead to a lot of attacks, lot of crazy attacks, and this leads to very dynamic position. Let's say your opponent goes c, you play bishop to f5, knight to d7, queen to c7, long castles. Let me show how it looks. Opponent goes knight to f3, you go knight to d7, opponent goes bishop to e2, you play queen to c7, and you take control of this diagonal. And let's say your opponent goes bishop to e3, you long castle. Let's say your opponent short castles. So yes, we completed the opening stage of the game, and further what you can do is you can put this rook on g8 as I already said, and you can go h5, h4, h3 and start a king side attack and bang on white's safety on the king side. So this also leads to exciting positions. So it's your matter of choice. After this, knight to c3 takes knight takes. It's up to you. You can choose knight to f6, and after white takes, you can play the Tartakower or the Bronchstein-Larsen, whichever is comfortable for you and interesting for you. You can choose that. Okay. Here we also had this bishop to f5, which I told you before. So this bishop to f5 is the classical variation. This leads to a lot of theory, which if you are very interested, you can just go and learn. It's easy to learn only. Because I don't want to make this video a detailed explanation. This is going to be a introduction to an opening, which will eventually equip you to play this opening and know all the ideas of the opening. This is not a detailed theory course. I will make a of this opening in detail later. So yeah, you hit this knight on e4 by playing this bishop to f5, and the main move goes like, white can even go to c3, which is a sideline, or even go to c5. But the main move goes to g. This is the main line, and they counterattack our bishop. We drop our bishop back. Let's say The famous variation is one of the famous variations is the h4 variation, which actually tries to trap your bishop after h5 because our bishop cannot go to these squares. So in this position, we go h6, okay, to make a room for our bishop. We just play h6. We don't go h5 in this position. We don't push our pawn two squares. We just push it one square in this position because in certain cases, if we put our pawn on h5 and our bishop is traded, once we castle, this pawn on h5 this pawn on h5 loses a guard and it can be captured by this knight. So these are certain intricacies of this openings. This will be very helpful to advanced players who are watching this video. So you don't, if you are a beginner or an intermediate player, you don't need to know all these nuances of this opening. So I'm just explaining certain ideas behind the theory of this opening. So you play h6, delay knight to f3. You develop the queen side knight to d7 first before going knight to f6 or e6, because this stops knight to e5, because knight to e5 just tries to threaten the pawn. So there is a certain reason behind this opening. Let's say the opponent goes bishop to d3. Now you take, they capture the queen. Now you go e6. Let's say they castle. You go knight to f6. Let's say they go bishop to e3. You can go bishop to e7 or bishop to d6. Let's say you go bishop to e7. Your opponent brings the rook to the center. You castle short, and then he plays the move c3. You can develop your queen to c7, and you will you're eventually trying to play c5 and challenge white center after bringing the rook to the center, like putting the rook on d8 and putting this rook on c8. And you will This is how this opening will progress. That's the main idea. That is the c5 break. Sorry, that's not c5, that's c4. And pawns don't go two squares right now. Yeah, the pawn goes to after bringing the rooks. So this will challenge the white center and it will equalize the position. So this is an example of one such line of the classical variation, and there are many lines. There are like this position. Yeah, here, yeah. In this position, white has knight e2, white has bishop to f4, white has bishop to d3 in this position, I believe. White has a lot of lines there. So if you're interested in the theory of the classical variation, stay tuned. I will make a course on that. So these are the options once your opponent captures your pawn on e4. There is also another variation, that is, we played knight f6, right? And your opponent capture, and in this case, however, you have to double these pawns, okay? That is the g pawn or the e pawn. So here there is another variation, like to avoid this doubling of pawns, we play knight to d7. This is known as the Karpov variation, named after the former world champion Anatoly Karpov. This is named after Anatoly Karpov, and this idea of this knight is to play knight to f6, and once white takes, you recapture with this knight, this queen's knight. So that's the main idea behind this opening. But what often happens is sometimes black tends to get checkmate if they don't know what they do. For example, white can play this tricky looking move queen to e2, and I don't want you to play knight to f6 in this position, because this is a critical blunder. In all the other variations, you generally play knight to f6 and white captures over knight, we recapture. That's how it goes. If you play knight to f6 in this position, this is a blunder, and white just wins the game by playing knight to d6. And this is a beautiful smothered mate. You can see the queen has vision to the e7 pawn, and it is pinned to the king. So you cannot capture this knight, okay? And you are under a check, and all your pieces just surround you to death. So in 6 moves there is a possibility of getting checkmated. So if you really want to play Karpov variation, you just make some your own study and analysis and then play this. So you just choose either knight to f6 or bishop to f5 depending upon what you like. So that is the classical variation. So we saw the exchange variation, we also saw the classical variation. Okay, what else is there? Let's say your opponent takes. There is also this. That's the exchange variation. Your opponent can also play this move c4, which is the Panov attack in the Caro Kann defense. We saw the exchange variation. Once he takes, he develops the knight. You develop your knight, and you know the drill, right? But let's say he plays c4. This is quite tricky. Don't play e6 in this position. You play knight to f6, defending this pawn. Don't play e6 right away. Let's say your opponent goes knight to f3. Now you can play e6. Now you play e6 and then you play bishop to d7. Don't rush to develop your bishop outside this pawn chain in this particular variation. Don't develop your bishop outside. You can actually, but in certain cases, if you don't know the theory, there may be some bishop to b5 check followed by queen to a4 and slicing you along this diagonal. And if you don't have your light square bishop defending this, it will be difficult for a beginner player to just handle such positions. So you just develop your bishops, the knights, then you castle, and you just continue with life. So these are the things that can possibly happen in the exchange and the classical variation. Let's say my opponent doesn't play d4. Let's say he plays knight f3. What do I do? You go d5. Okay. Say your opponent goes knight to c3. You take the pawn. Okay. They recapture. Again, you can go knight to f6 and challenge this. This will eventually transform you into the Tartakower variation. And see, this knight is already there on f3, which is not a good square for the knight in the Tartakower variation of the Caro Kann defense. So the knight doesn't actually belong there. So it's advantage for us. So it just transforms into the same positions which I told you earlier. So okay, these are the possibilities. There is one more option that white can do. That is after d4, d5, we saw exchange, we saw him protecting the pawn. Now what white can do is white can advance the pawn to e5, and this is known as the advanced variation of the Caro Kann defense. Simple, right? They're advancing the pawn to e5, so it's named advanced variation. So that's it. So there are two main continuations for black. The main continuation is bishop to f5, and there is also a tricky line that is c5. Okay, c5. A lot of beginner, not even beginner, a lot of strong intermediate players don't know the main move here. The main move for white actually is to take this pawn. Okay, take this pawn, play a3, and try to play b4, defending this pawn, forming this pawn chain. And then there is something like f4, knight to f3, and that is a perfect uh, fight against this c5 variation of the Caro Kann defense. Okay, but trust me, a lot of players don't know this theory, and even if they do so, you can develop this knight to c6. You can play bishop to f5, e6, and slowly regain this pawn. Okay, you can slowly regain this pawn eventually, and this pawn is also weak, so it happens. So you can do, but a lot of players, 95% of players, I would say, they just go c3 or they find a mean to defend this pawn. Okay, you play knight to c6. Don't capture immediately. You just develop this knight. Let's say they develop their knight. Now you pin this knight to the queen. See, here we have this beautiful pin. which is trying to destabilize the center. Okay, right now white center is perfectly defended, but the knight is actually not defending, it's pinned. So this will destabilize the center. Let's say your opponent goes bishop to e2, you take this knight. Okay, once the pin is broken, you take this knight. Once white recaptures, now you capture on the center. He has to recapture with the pawn. And if you see the transformed position, now you play e6. Okay, this pawn on d4 looks like it's supporting e5 pawn, and it is restricting a lot of important squares, like we cannot put our knight on f6, we cannot develop our bishop to d6. So you may think this is such a powerful pawn, but the catch is this is our target. That is a weak pawn. Okay, if we collapse this pawn easily, this e5 pawn will also fall. You can see. So the main target is to pile up on that pawn. You can do it by developing the king side pieces. It's tricky to develop these pieces. Uh, for example, if you go knight to h6, he's going to capture your knight. White will capture the knight and damage your king side. So we don't want that. What we have to do here is we have to first develop this knight to e7, and we can go to f5. I would suggest going to f5, or you can even go to g6. That's your choice. But I would say it's better to go to f5, because from f5 the knight controls the d4 square and it puts pressure on this d4 pawn. So you will eventually put a lot of pressure on this d4 square and you will win that pawn easily. So it looks something like, let's say your opponent goes e3, you develop this knight, say castles, you develop this knight, your opponent goes bishop to e3 to defend this pawn. And now you can develop your bishop to e7, later play queen to b6, castle, and there will be a triple attack on this pawn while your queen is also pressurizing b2, and it will be very difficult for white to actually hold this pawn properly. A lot of intermediate players just lose this pawn very easily. I have a ton of games, I have played these variations, and a lot of players, like around 16, 1700, 1750 players tend to lose that pawn easily. Some 1800s defend the pawn somehow by finding the right moves, but most of the players will lose this pawn. And if this pawn on d4 is lost, this will also be lost very easily, because it's very tough to defend this e5 pawn for white. So this is the idea behind this c5 advanced variation, that is the playing the move c5. What you can also do here is play bishop to f5. Okay, this is the main move of the advanced variation, and the idea behind this move is we don't want to block this light squared bishop by playing e6, because it will be stuck within this pawn chain and this bishop cannot go anywhere out. It will not see the daylight, which is a common disadvantage of the French defense. I hope you all know the French defense, which goes with e4. I will wait. I will show it. E4, E6, D4, D5. As you can see, this position, this bishop is blocked. So this is known as a bad French bishop. So the main idea of the Caro Kann defense is we have the solid integrity of the pawn structures, but still we can develop this bishop to a more active square than getting it restricted over there. So let's say they go E5, you go bishop to F5. This is the main move, and white has a lot of options here. The best variation is knight to f3 followed by bishop to e2, which is known as the short variation of the Caro Kann defense. That is the advanced Caro Kann defense. Don't try to remember all these names. If you can remember, great. If not, just know the general ideas of the position. That's more than enough. Let's say they go f3, you go e6, and after bishop to e2, you can develop this knight to e7, then to g6, then you go d7, castle, and slowly build up for the c5 advance. We have to do the c5 break, or we cannot, what to say, we cannot gain the advantage and we cannot equalize. We equalize the position by playing c5 because right now white has a lot of space on the king side. Okay, as you can see, white has a lot of space in this position of the board. if we if you do all the right things, that's like developing the knight, you know developing the bishop, developing the other knight, maybe if you just castle, then develop the rooks, the queen, everything, and if you don't play this move c5, you will ever get cramped in this position. So remember this key move c5. This has to happen. Don't play it too early, because sometimes it's not good to open your king too early in this variation. Generally, we don't open the center while the king is still in the center, which is one of the chess principles. So you develop your pieces, then you eventually open up the center. So that's the general idea of that short. Your opponent can also play something like knight to f3, sorry, knight to c3, and then g4. This is a great idea to trap your bishop, which is, let's say your opponent goes knight to c3, and let's say you go e6, your opponent can go g4. Wait, what? G4? You cannot go here because they will take, and this pawn is very difficult to defend, and it can easily be won by white. Okay, so this is not good, and let's say you go back, white just goes h4 and simply goes after your bishop. Okay, so this is pretty much, trying to trappy variation of the advanced variation, if you want to remember it like that. But the main line here with the idea of trapping the bishop is the h4 move. In this position, once you play bishop to f5, white plays this innocent looking move h4. You will be like, okay, my opponent just developed a pawn to the flank. What is about that? He's not a principled guy. He's not developing the pieces to the center. He's simply pushing the pawn there. No, this is such a deadly move, this h4. If you just play e6, white goes g4, you can go bishop to e4, white goes f3, you go bishop to g6, and you will get your bishop trapped. Okay, so we don't want that. Your bishop cannot go anywhere there. Maybe you can just sacrifice this, and that just helps the queen to develop. So this bishop gets trapped. So what I want you to do is, once you see this move h4 and any other moves trying to trap your bishop there, you play this move h5. h4, you respond with h5. In the classical variation, when opponent played h4, you can rewind the video and watch that part. We played the move h6. Okay, but in the advanced variation, after h4 we go h5. Okay, we just stop the advance of this flank pawn, and then the general idea is we go e6, and we eventually go for the c5 break later in the game after developing the knight. And let's say your opponent brings the bishop, you can even trade the bishop. Like, for example, let's say your opponent goes bishop d3, you can capture that, then you can develop this knight, can put it to g6 or f5. Okay, once you develop this knight to these two squares, any of them which is suitable to the position, then you can develop the bishop to e7, then you can develop this queenside knight to d7, and you can go for the c5 break. Okay, which looks something like, it's a castles, knight to g6, and let's say bishop to e3, you go bishop to e7, and let's say white goes knight to c3, you go knight to d7. So these two pieces just aim for the c5 push. As you can see, Once we go c5, these two minor pieces support this c5 push to be effective. Let's say he goes rook d1, you can castle. Let's say he brings the other rook, you can go and execute this move c5. Then you can bring the rooks, then you can develop the queen, and you can bring the other rook, and you can just put a lot of pressure because this knight g6, knight on g6 also exerts a pressure on this pawn. Once we dislodge this d4 pawn, this becomes weak, and you can pile up on this e5 pawn. So these are the basic ideas of the advanced variation of the Caro Kann defense, and yeah, hope you learned a lot from this video. And please don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel, and it will motivate me to make more videos which will be very helpful to all of you. And thank you so much.